People think the Taliban were defeated with bombs and bullets. That's the easy version. The real story is quieter. It's early morning in Helmand Province. 2010. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but the dust is already in the air. U.S. soldiers move through a village that looks calm, too calm. No flags, no uniforms, no enemy in sight. And that's the problem. Because the Taliban never stood in lines. They never wore ranks. They watched from doorways, rooftops, fields. They waited. They learned. And when you made one mistake, they punished it. The U.S. military didn't take down the Taliban in one battle. It happened step by step, village by village, road by road, month by month. First, you had to understand the ground, then the people, then the enemy hiding among both. Some days, winning meant not firing a single round. Other days, it meant pulling a wounded soldier out of the dirt while bullets cracked inches above your head. This wasn't about conquest. It was about pressure, patience, presence, and it came at a cost. What you're about to hear isn't strategy from a briefing room. It's the war as it was lived, by boots on the ground, in places like Sanjin, Marja, Kandahar, and Nawa. This is how the U.S. military slowly broke the Taliban's grip. Not all at once, not cleanly, but step by step. When the U.S. military first arrived in Afghanistan in late 2001, the mission looked simple on paper. Find the Taliban, remove them from power, make sure they can't come back. At the start, it worked fast. Kabul fell in November 2001. Kandahar followed weeks later. Taliban fighters melted away, not defeated in the way armies usually are, but dissolved. They shaved beards, dropped weapons, crossed borders, blended back into villages. To the outside world, it looked like victory. On the ground, it felt unfinished. By 2003, U.S. patrols in places like Kandahar Province, Helmand, and Kunar started noticing something strange. There were no front lines, no uniforms, no clear enemy movement. Villages were quiet during the day, too quiet. Then, at night, things happened. Roads were damaged. Local leaders disappeared. U.S. convoys hit explosives that weren't there the day before. This was the first lesson, and it was a hard one. The Taliban were no longer an army. They were a shadow. Early on, U.S. forces relied heavily on mobility and firepower. Patrols moved fast. Convoys rolled through villages. Raids targeted known Taliban leaders based on intelligence. But Afghanistan didn't work like Iraq, and it didn't work like Europe. In districts like Sanjin and Marja, controlling a road for one day meant nothing if you left it the next. The Taliban didn't need to win battles. They just needed to wait. By 2006 to 2008, IEDs became the Taliban's most effective weapon. Cheap, easy to hide, psychologically devastating. Every dirt road became a threat. Every step became a calculation. U.S. soldiers stopped thinking in miles. They thought in meters. This forced the first real shift. Instead of clear and move on, the strategy slowly became clear, hold, stay. That's why outposts started appearing in places no one wanted to live. Small combat outposts in the middle of hostile districts. Cops in Sanjin. Patrol bases in Nawa. Tiny positions surrounded by people who might help you or kill you. The idea was simple but brutal. If you stay long enough, the Taliban lose freedom of movement. This was the most misunderstood part of the war. The Taliban didn't survive because everyone loved them. They survived because fear worked. In villages across Helmand, civilians lived between two forces. U.S. troops by day, Taliban intimidation by night. If a villager helped coalition forces, the Taliban remembered names, faces, families. So the U.S. military changed its focus. Patrols slowed down. Soldiers walked instead of drove. They learned routes, names, routines. This wasn't kindness. It was survival. You couldn't fight an invisible enemy without understanding the human terrain. Marines and Army units began mapping villages not just by roads, but by relationships. Who talked to whom? Who avoided eye contact? Who left town before operations? In Nawa district, when U.S. Marines stayed permanently instead of rotating through, attacks dropped. Not because the Taliban vanished, but because their space to operate shrank. This was another lesson. The Taliban thrive where the government is absent. Presence mattered more than power. By 2009, the war entered a new phase. President Obama authorized a troop surge, sending tens of thousands of additional U.S. troops to Afghanistan. The focus was southern Afghanistan, Helmand and Kandahar, the Taliban heartland. This wasn't about chasing fighters into mountains anymore. It was about pressure, daily patrols, constant presence, no gaps. In places like Marja, U.S. forces moved street by street, sometimes clearing the same area multiple times. The Taliban adapted, but adaptation works both ways. Every IED found was one less that could be used. Every weapons cache seized weakened future attacks. Every local ally quietly gained confidence. This wasn't fast. It wasn't clean. And it wasn't visible on maps. But over time, Taliban operations became more reactive than proactive. They hit when they could, not when they wanted. This step-by-step approach wasn't free. Casualties mounted. Mental strain grew heavier. Units spent months in the same districts, losing friends to bombs that cost a few $100s to build. There were no victory parades in Sanjin. No dramatic turning point. Just slow, grinding pressure. Soldiers learned patience the hard way. You could do everything right and still lose someone. You could win every firefight and still feel like nothing changed. But something was changing. Taliban fighters were being pushed out of population centers. Their intimidation weakened where coalition forces stayed long enough. Afghan security forces began taking the lead in areas that used to be untouchable. It wasn't defeat yet, but it was momentum. And momentum is how wars like this are won, or at least contained. By 2010, the U.S. military understood something clearly. You couldn't defeat the Taliban by chasing fighters alone. You had to break the system that fed them. The Taliban didn't move randomly. They had safe houses, supply routes, financiers, bomb makers, and messengers. If one part was removed, another filled the gap. So the strategy shifted again. This time, it became precise. In districts like Sanjin, Garmsur, and Arghan Dab, U.S. units stopped relying only on big movements. Instead, they built intelligence slowly, sometimes painfully slow. Patrols listened more than they talked. Local elders were watched, not trusted. Patterns mattered more than promises. Who left the village before an operation? Who suddenly had money? Who never slept at home? By late 2009 and early 2010, night operations increased. These weren't loud invasions like people imagine. Most were quiet, fast, controlled. Helicopters came low. Doors opened. Specific men were taken. Not killed. Removed. Bomb makers. Couriers. Mid-level commanders. The people who connected fighters to weapons. Each removal created confusion. Not panic, confusion. And confusion breaks networks. In February 2010, the U.S. and coalition forces launched Operation Moshtarak in Marja, Helmand province. This wasn't a secret attack. Everyone knew it was coming, including the Taliban. That was the point. Instead of surprising the enemy, the goal was to hold territory permanently. Marines moved in block by block. Taliban fighters chose to flee or blend in. Some stayed and fought. Most waited. IEDs filled the ground. Progress was slow, painfully slow. Some areas were cleared multiple times. But this time, units didn't leave. Patrol bases went up. Afghan flags followed. The Taliban lost something important in Marja. A safe space. Not total control. Not influence. But freedom. By 2011, Afghan National Army, ANA, and Afghan National Police, ANP, units began leading more operations, especially in Kandahar city and surrounding districts. They knew the terrain. They knew the families. They knew who didn't belong. U.S. forces didn't disappear, but they stepped back. This was fragile. Some Afghan units were strong. Others collapsed under pressure. Corruption hurt progress. Fear still worked in many places. But in key areas, Taliban movement became riskier. Checkpoints stayed manned. Schools reopened. Local officials stopped hiding. Not everywhere. Not forever. But enough to matter. What finally weakened the Taliban wasn't one operation. It was never letting them rest. IED teams were hunted constantly. Supply routes were watched. Cross-border movement became harder. drone surveillance, human intelligence, and Afghan cooperation combined. Taliban commanders started avoiding phones. Meetings became shorter. Trust broke down inside their own ranks. When fighters spend more time hiding than planning, attacks decrease. By 2012, Taliban attacks in some southern districts dropped significantly. Not because they surrendered, but because the cost of operating openly became too high. The war hadn't ended, but the balance shifted. Even at this stage, the U.S. military knew the truth. You can weaken an insurgency. You can disrupt it. You can push it back. But destroying it completely requires something military force can't guarantee: a stable, trusted local government. And that part was always uncertain. Still, step by step, the Taliban's grip loosened in key areas. Not through headlines, not through speeches, through pressure, through patience, through time. By 2013, the war felt different. Not quieter, just thinner. U.S. bases in places like Sanjin, now Zad, and parts of Kandahar province were closing or shrinking. Patrols became shorter. Air support was still there, but it came with more rules. The mission had shifted. Combat operations were no longer the center. Training Afghan forces was. On paper, the numbers looked strong. Hundreds of thousands trained. Modern weapons, uniforms, vehicles. On the ground, reality didn't move in straight lines. The Taliban didn't rush back in tanks or columns. They waited. In districts where U.S. and Afghan forces stayed present, they kept their distance. In places where patrols stopped, they came back quietly. Not with flags, with whispers. They visited families at night. They reminded shopkeepers who really controlled the roads after dark. They punished collaborators slowly, carefully. Fear doesn't need numbers. By 2014, as NATO officially ended its combat mission, the Taliban had learned something valuable. They didn't need to defeat the U.S. military. They just had to outlast it. From 2015 to 2018, Afghan soldiers fought harder than most people will ever know. They took casualties daily. They held checkpoints that no longer made the news. They defended districts with limited air support and delayed supplies. Some units stood their ground. Others broke. Not because they were weak, but because morale breaks faster than bodies. Taliban attacks became sharper. Targeted. Assassinations. Complex assaults in cities like Kabul, Ghazni, and Lashkar-Gah. The network had rebuilt itself. Not everywhere. Not the same way. But enough. By the time U.S. forces dropped below 10,000 troops, the war had changed shape. No more constant pressure. No more daily disruption. Taliban commanders moved openly again in rural areas. Courts reopened. Taxes were collected. Justice, harsh, fast, unforgiving, returned. Villages made calculations. Not about loyalty. About survival. When the final collapse came in 2021, it looked fast on television. It wasn't. It had been forming for years. Deals made quietly. Units abandoned without orders. Cities falling without fights. The Taliban didn't win because they were stronger in 2021. They won because they were still there. The U.S. military didn't fail to fight. It fought exceptionally well. It cleared ground. It held ground. It trained forces. What it couldn't do was replace a nation's political will. Wars like Afghanistan don't end with surrender documents. They fade. They leave. They wait. For American soldiers, the war didn't end with a flight home. It ended in pieces. A road that still looks dangerous. A sound that makes your body react before your mind does. A name you remember faster than your own. The Taliban survived the war. But so did the memory of every step taken to stop them. Village by village. Year by year. Step by step. And that's the part history often forgets.